Well, Christmas is a very convenient holiday. It's a solar holiday. It's on the solar calendar, which means that every December 25th, there it is. You can plan for it. You can expect it. Easter, on the other hand, is associated with the lunar calendar, and it can show up any time in about a span of 28 days. Because Easter, in the West at least, is always the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. Somebody paid more attention to the sky than we do. So it can show up in that 28-day span, and sometimes it's really late, and that's really nice, as late as the 21st of April. Some years it's really early as the 23rd of March. And that is really inconvenient. And this year it was just 1 week after the earliest it could be, which was really inconvenient. You know, Christmas was over, we were just about ready to take a deep breath, and somebody said, "It's almost Ash Wednesday," which came on the 14th of February this year. And I had a good laugh that it was also Valentine's Day. I thought, great, happy Valentine's Day, you're going to die. Because Ash Wednesday is when we remember our mortality and the fact that we really do need to pay attention to the events of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, because we don't have unlimited time. And then, as if that weren't bad enough, I looked to see what the date of Easter was, and it was April 1st, April Fool's Day. And my first inclination was, because I remembered this old joke. I can't even remember the joke now, but I do remember the punchline. And had something to do with the Pope canceling Easter. And the punchline was, they found the body. And so my first thought was, April Fool's, it's all a hoax, right? So I thought, let's bury that lead, because that won't preach. But then I thought, you know, maybe that April Fool's joke goes the other way. Like, our whole understanding of how reality works is that you live for a while, and then you die, and then it's all over with. April Fools! Jesus has risen from the dead. Death is not the most powerful force. It does not have the last word, even not in the life of Jesus or even in the life of each of us. Because at the very core of our Christian faith is this conviction that the Word of God became a human being, born as a baby, grown up as a human being, became learned in the law, became an itinerant preacher and a healer and a teacher and a preacher and someone who loved others. And someone who was willing to take upon himself the sins of a world, that they might be reconciled, that we might be reconciled to God forever. At the very center and core of our Christian faith is this claim that Jesus of Nazareth died on the cross and was raised again from the dead. And just for the record, so that we don't have another Jonah moment here at First Presbyterian Church, those of you who have been around for the last couple months will know what I'm talking about. Pastor Dave believes that Jesus Christ was really killed on the cross and that he really rose from the dead. The resurrection and the crucifixion are both factual and true, not one or the other. Because, as Paul, points out in one of his letters, if it were not so, then we of all people would be most to be pitied. Because the whole structure of our Christian faith is built on the reality that the God of the universe became one of us, lived among us, suffered death for us, and then destroyed the power of death for us that it might not have the last word in our lives. And all these weeks of Lent, I have been preaching about the subversiveness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And by that I mean that the gospel of Jesus Christ, the realities that we proclaim and bear witness to, dig the foundation out from under our everyday reality, our expectations about what is true, about power, and about love, and about God, and about our relationship with God. Everything that we take for granted, everything that we assume to be true, the gospel of Jesus Christ is undermining in order to show us an alternate reality, which is in fact the only reality. The reality that the Bible calls the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven, and that it's breaking into us. And this claim of the resurrection is the final subversion of our understanding of reality. We have all kinds of saying, there's nothing certain in life except death and taxes. Only the gospel says, maybe taxes, but not death. It breaks up our expectations about what's important and what we have to plan for, about what can harm us and what cannot. But there is in the back of all of our heads, I know there is in mine, even though I proclaim boldly that Jesus Christ was crucified, dead, buried, and raised from the dead on the third day, and I believe that totally, there is this voice in the back of my head that even on Easter Sunday morning, it says, yeah, prove it. Or, really? Are you sure? And I just sort of, push it to the back because I've had that argument with that voice enough times that I'm pretty sure I won it. So I'm not going to keep having it. And I imagine if y'all were honest about it, that voice also exists in the back of your minds once in a while, and you probably push it aside as well. And the reality is that there are a lot of people in our lives, in our midst, and maybe even in church with us this morning, who are still really arguing with that voice and have not come to the conclusion of whether they really think these things happened or not. And it really is a critical question to answer in your own mind. Because as I said, without that reality, the Christian faith and all of its moral teachings and all of its stories and all of its everything that we love, it all sort of crumbles away unless it's built on that foundation of the reality of Christ having died and been raised again and extending the promise to us that we too will defeat death when the time comes. So, that's so annoying. We have this fight inside our heads, and we have this argument going on in our midst. There are some of us who are more involved in that questioning than others of us. And in the midst of that comes Mark's story about the resurrection. Mark is the gospel that was assigned to us for this year by the lectionary, and we've been following him all through Lent and his story. And I've been trying to get you familiar with what makes Mark's gospel distinct from the other three. All four gospels are telling the same story, but they're each telling it from a different point of view. You've heard the old story about 5 blind men and an elephant. And you asked, one is feeling the leg, and another's feeling the trunk, and one's holding onto the tail, and one is fingering the ears. And you ask the first one, what's an elephant like? It's like a tree. And you ask the second one, it's like a rope. And you ask the one on the trunk end, that's like a snake. And the other one says it's like a giant leaf, because they each have a piece of the same reality. They're all describing elephant, but they're all describing a different experience. The 4 gospel writers are like that. The 4 gospel writers are like that. And so it's really important as you're reading each of them to find not just the commonalities among the 4, but what makes them distinctive. And Mark's gospel opens at Jesus' baptism with the ripping of the sky, the separation between heaven and earth, And a dove descends through that opening, and a voice is heard speaking out of that opening, and it says, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." And at the end of Mark's telling of the gospel, at the crucifixion, the earth trembles, and the curtain of the temple is torn. Same Greek word, torn asunder. And that curtain in the temple is what separates the Holy of Holies from ordinary space, profane space, the separation from of the holy from the worldly. So you have those bookends at the beginning and the end of Mark's gospel. And his point is that everything that happens while Jesus is in the world is like a ripping of the separation between heaven and earth. And as Jesus marches relentlessly and urgently through the world, people are drawn to him. Demons are frightened of him. Human beings and religious leaders and political leaders are confused and then frightened by him. Everything begins to shake and shatter while Jesus is in the world, because the separation of that world from this one is being torn apart. That's Mark's whole deal. And his conviction is that that represents a crisis for us that we have to respond to. We have to be ready to jump in one direction or another, because the world is changing with Jesus' presence in our lives. On Thursday night, we read part of Mark's gospel, and it was about the Garden of Gethsemane, and it was the story, part of the story where Jesus and his disciples have gone to the garden to pray, and Judas has come and kissed Jesus and betrayed him with a kiss. And the soldiers have come and laid hands on Jesus. And the mob is shouting and, making a crisis happen. And Jesus' disciples disperse in fear. And then there's this very strange verse in that. It's verse 51 of chapter 14. And if you took it out, the story would read perfectly smoothly. So you got to wonder, why does Mark put this verse, right in the middle? And here's what it says. There was a young man dressed only in a linen sheet, and they grabbed hold of him, and he ran away, leaving the sheet behind him. He ran away naked. It is the weirdest thing in the Gospel of Mark. And Mark, who's so careful about how he uses words, nothing is wasted. So he doesn't put things in, oh, by the way, there was this guy. That's not Mark. He put that in there for a reason, and many scholars believe, and I believe firmly, because I don't think you can understand Mark if you don't believe this, that's his signature. That's his point of view. That's where he stands in the story that he is telling. He is a young man, maybe a late teenager, maybe 17 or 18, or younger maybe. He's on the outside of the inner circle or on the inside of the outer circle. He's probably somebody's son. He knows these characters firsthand. I believe he's, of the four gospel writers, he's the only eyewitness to these events. And this is where he stands in all of this. I'm the guy. I'm that guy who, when push came to shove, when the moment came, when the crisis happened, and I needed to either choose for or against Jesus, I ran away. And I think the linen sheet is a symbol. It's like he left all of his pretenses about himself behind. He was naked in the sense of he couldn't pretend about himself anymore. That's the experience, I think, that makes Mark decide to write his gospel. That Jesus represents a crisis moment that requires a response from each of us. I'm the guy who failed the test. I want you to be the guys who don't. That's his purpose for writing his gospel. Which, when you come to what we just read, helps to make real sense of it. The oldest versions of the Gospel of Mark that we have, and in our understanding of how to understand and interpret the Bible, we always try to work with the oldest texts available as being the most authentic. The oldest text that we have available of Mark's Gospel, the Gospel ends right where I stopped reading. And they were afraid, and they told no one, and they ran away. They ran away and told nothing, for they were afraid. Now, there's other stuff in that, the Bible that you have. If you open it, there are more verses after that. And I'm not saying that those verses aren't the Word of God or that God didn't want them to be there. All I'm arguing is that Mark didn't write them. That Mark ended his gospel. So don't take out your scissors and cut out those last verses. God put them there for a reason. I don't know what that reason is. Plus, if you cut out those last pages of Mark, you'll probably also cut out the first pages of Luke, and that would be a bad thing. I'm not in favor of people taking the scissors to the Bible, but my only argument is that Mark stopped with that, and they ran away, for they were afraid. And the reason is because Mark isn't so much interested in telling you what happened. He's aware of all the beach and and Jesus appearing on the beach and making fish and having breakfast. He's aware of the upper room and all of that stuff. He knows that. But he doesn't care to tell you about that because he wants to stop this story right there. They were afraid. They ran away. They told no one. Because he wants you to join the story. He wants you to ask, what would I do in that situation? What would I say? Who would I tell? What would I do? Would I run away? That's Mark's question. He wants you to finish his gospel for him. He wants you to supply the post-resurrection appearances and stories about how God shows up in the world, how the risen Christ shows up in the world by what you do, by what you say, by what you believe. They ran away and told no one. What will you do? I have to confess about my own journey with regard to the reality of the resurrection and the crucifixion. I did not start my Christian journey with the belief that the crucifixion and resurrection were real, actual historical events. That's not where I started. That's where I ended up. Where I started was the child of a Christian family, with the question in my mind, did these things really happen? Did Jesus Christ rise from the dead on that day? I didn't disbelieve that, because there's no more evidence that it didn't happen than there is evidence that it did happen. It happened a long time ago, and I wasn't there. So how do I know that Jesus is raised from the dead? You might say faith. And I would agree with you, but not faith in the sense of forcing yourself to believe something just because. Certainly not forcing myself to believe in something just because I'm afraid I might die otherwise. What I decided in those early years of my life, that there was no way to know at the beginning whether or not these things are true. And if you are a person who is wondering whether or not these things are true and reliable, then I urge you to start where I started. I was a child of the faith, and I was a child of a family of faith. There were people who told me this story is true. And they were telling me that out of their own life experience. My mom, my dad, my older brother, my older sister, my brother-in-law, my grandmother, my Sunday school teachers, my pastors, friends in the community, friends my own age. Many of these people were people who had lived as though these claims about Jesus and his resurrection are true. And that is the place to begin. To live as though these things are true. Because if you live as though they are true, you will soon discover whether in fact they are true. True in your own life. Because the people who witnessed to me were people who had had hard experiences in their lives. My grandmother witnessed to her faith in the resurrection, having been a young bride whose husband died in the flu epidemic of 1918, leaving her alone and pregnant with my mother. She was a woman who had to support her mother and her daughter without a husband during the Depression. My mom and dad, as many of you and your parents did, lived through the Second World War and the difficulties of that experience. The people who witnessed to me about the reality of the resurrection were people who had lived through cancer, people who had lived through the sorrow of watching someone they love make bad choices and destroy their lives, who had experienced the death of a child, the hardest things in the world. People who understood, even though they'd never been nailed to a cross, people who understood firsthand what crucifixion is and what it means. People who understood that God doesn't promise us that there will be no crucifixions. People who understood that God doesn't control our decisions, and God's power and love is not such that it controls other people's decisions. God is not a God who keeps us from being shattered by our experiences, but rather that God is present as resurrection in the midst of all of our crucifixions. That our God is near to us, and that His love and His power is the love and power to gather up our shattered pieces and reassemble them into something holy. Japanese potters have a tradition of when a teapot or a teacup gets broken, they gather the shards together and they glue them back together with a golden glue or a golden cement. And when that pot is reassembled, they consider it to be more precious and more beautiful than before it was broken, because it is laced and veined with these golden lines. The people who witnessed to the truth and reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ were people who had lived through crucifixions of their own and had experienced God's power of resurrection. My commitment at the beginning of my Christian journey was that I would live as though Christ's crucifixion were real. My conviction towards the end of my Christian journey is that it in fact happened that way. That it is the nature of God to bring resurrection out of crucifixion, which He manifested in the actual life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And that in that manifested love is the promise that we too will defeat death and be embraced by God for eternity. Within that is the promise that we will be put together like a Japanese pot, and that we will be more holy and more beautiful when we have been reassembled from our broken shards than we were before we started. If you live as though these accounts are true, you will experience the reality in your own life, and then you will begin to be able to proclaim and bear witness to the reality of the resurrection. And that's where Mark, the gospel writer, wants to bring you with that weird, abrupt, unsatisfying ending to his gospel. He wants you to come to that point and ask you, what will you do? Who will you tell? Are you afraid? One of the ways that you answer Mark is to live as though it is true. To discover that it is in fact true. To find ways in your life to proclaim to the people around you that it is true, that it is your personal experience that Christ was raised from the dead because I was also. He wants you to write the post-resurrection appearances of Christ that you have known. That's why he ends it in such a weird, unfinished way. Mark's gospel is a gospel that only you can write the ending to. Thanks be to God.